Chapter 16, A Family Lost and a Family Found. After the holidays passed without any incidents, the children nearly forgot about the night the clan gathered in front of the home. Things returned to normal. The only exception was little Tom began to come by a few times each week, cleaning up around the yard. The first time Miss Johnson seemed surprised to see him there, but after talking with him it became a regular arrangement. Little Tom said nothing to the children at first and wouldn't even look Eliza Beth in the face. For her part, Eliza seemed to forget visiting with him while he put up the Christmas lights. Then the focus was the whole thing about the lights, something quite unusual. Now that the mountain was doing everyday tasks, Eliza Beth spoke neither to the man nor about him. In fact, she seemed oblivious to his presence there at all. Of course, little Tom was the size of an ox, and anything but an oblivious presence. The fact that Eliza didn't respond at all to the man was clearly by choice. She merely pushed his presence aside in her mind. Other things needed addressed first. At breakfast one day, Eliza asked, "Miss Johnson, if Johnny loved me and saved my life, then why didn't he want to spend more time with me, and how come he left me again?" She thought of his presence over Christmas as a return and not merely a visit. "I don't understand." Miss Johnson explained, "I guess the best way to understand that is to learn about Johnny's earlier years here. Of course you know some of this, how Johnny's father died before he was born and his mother died when he was just old enough to still have some memory of her." Miss Johnson paused to look at Eliza Beth before asking, "Did I ever tell you that her name was Elizabeth?" Eliza just nodded her head back and forth in response. "After a couple of years at the orphanage, Johnny became quite attached to the home, and I suppose to me as well. One day a couple came and they were interested in adopting Johnny. But it scared and upset him so much. He threw a tantrum every time they came to visit. Eventually they decided he was too temperamental and looked elsewhere for another boy to adopt. Johnny never had another opportunity for adoption. I think perhaps he is concerned that if he is around too much, anyone who wants to adopt will have to compete with him for the children's attention and focus." Eliza's eyes suddenly opened wide and she asked, "What did you say was the name of Johnny's mother?" "Elizabeth, dear," she replied. "Elizabeth, Eliza Beth." The girl experimented with the name. "When I was a baby, how did you find out what my name was?" "We didn't know your name, and it didn't seem to be a good idea to ask around about you at the time. I let Johnny decide on a name for you. At first he wanted to call you Elizabeth, but later he decided you should have a name that was more of your own, so he changed it just a little bit." In amazement, Eliza said, "He named me after his mother?" This impressed upon Eliza just what she meant to Johnny. She regretted not allowing him to say goodbye before he left after graduating. She finally admitted to herself that it was her fault, and not his. She missed him terribly and hoped he'd come and visit her again very soon. Almost a year passed since Johnny graduated and left, and that time Eliza received a lot less attention. Before Johnny left, it never seemed like he wanted to spend time with her. Now she realized this had never been true at all. She wanted to tell him more than ever that she missed him and loved him. Even more, she wanted to hear him tell her that he loved her. For Eliza, some days were good and others were bad. Sometimes she seemed normal and other times she moped around the home and yard, just wandering back and forth, remembering times before Johnny left. By the gate, she remembered when people were walking by and Johnny would say, "Let's go in," or "Let's go out back and check the garden." Now she understood he was looking out for her, protecting her. Whenever she asked any questions about where she came from or what happened to her parents, Johnny always gave the same answers as Miss Johnson. Unlike Miss Johnson, he looked her in the eye while brushing back her hair. He was actually looking at the scar on her forehead and remembering. She didn't know that then. She longed to feel Johnny brushing her hair back like before. On the bad days, Eliza didn't have a good appetite. She ate a little bit, then started picking at the food and complaining. "It's too hot. It's too cold," etc. She thought about the times when Johnny ate with them. She remembered he always sat next to her when he could. Eliza wondered why she never saw that before. On the good days, she began to make friends with little Tom, though she was still rather afraid because of his size. She seemed to have forgotten about the fact that he'd been among the men responsible for the loss of her mother, father, and home. Once he went to brush back her hair, but Eliza recoiled from him. This was something for Johnny alone. One day Eliza walked over to little Tom, but she said nothing. She took to greeting him each time she saw him, but today there came no greeting. Eliza just stood there clutching her doll with both hands and furrowing her chin into the doll's hair. Her face looked particularly serious. This was a very bad day, and she spent much of it pondering the things Miss Johnson told her about her family. Little Tom wondered at Eliza's stance and her silence, but he said nothing and continued trimming back the rose bushes. Finally, in a cold, detached tone, Eliza asked, as though she just remembered it, "Why did you want to hurt me and my parents?" Little Tom stopped his work, pruning shears mid-cut, but said nothing. After waiting a moment, Eliza continued, "I think that Mayor Phillips did it because he's just plain mean. You're not mean at all, at least not now." He dropped his hand, which held the pruning shears, to his lap, and began to fidget with the tool, but still said nothing. Eliza, growing impatient with his silence, took his large chin into her small hands and turned his head to look her square in the eyes. She neither frowned nor smiled and hardly blinked as she stared him down with her large brown eyes. Never had the man seen such a serious face on an adult, and yet here was a mere child interrogating him. A big tear welled up in the corner of the mountain's eye and rolled down his cheek. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," he responded. "I'm a large man, but I never was one for thinking much. I just never seemed to be thought of as important. Being with that group of guys and all about their business, I felt like someone important. Never cared for all they said or did, but by golly, they treated me like somebody, made me feel like somebody. It weren't supposed to turn out the way it did. Honest, child, honest." Another tear streamed down his other cheek, then the floodgate opened and the man cried out amid his tears, "Forgive me, ma'am, forgive me. I'd give anything to take it back, anything except my own little girl, anything but that." Watching the mountain crying like that was the most pitiful thing Eliza ever saw in her life. With tears welling up in her own eyes, she hugged the man. Then she took out her handkerchief and dried Tom's face. Though she never said the words, it was apparent she forgave him. The cycle of good days and bad days continued. While the bad days became slightly fewer, they seemed to be far worse. On the good days, she waited for little Tom and helped him in the yard. One day, little Tom told Miss Johnson, "That's one of the only good things to come out of the whole situation." On the bad days, everyone learned to give her some distance. Then one bad day, when Eliza Beth was moping about the home, she heard Miss Johnson talking on the phone in her office. Eliza thought she heard her name and began to listen. She could only hear parts of what Miss Johnson said. She heard things like, "Well, she's been a little bit depressed since, but she's getting over it. Yesterday seemed a little better. I think she'd really enjoy being part of a family. Adoption is a serious decision. Think about it a little more." It may have been about someone else. To be honest, on the bad days, she was seldom aware of the other children in the home because she was too busy thinking and feeling sorry for her own self. Eliza wondered, is anyone depressed besides me? She wasn't sure, but maybe it was about her. Maybe someone would come and adopt her and she'd have parents who loved her. She began to stop outside the office frequently to see if Miss Johnson was talking to the person again. Eliza watched as Miss Johnson wrote down notes to herself and filled out different papers. Lately, Miss Johnson spent more time in her office, and Eliza Beth thought up many excuses to bother her there. She couldn't read very well yet, so she casually asked Miss Johnson what she was writing, pretending that it was to help her learn her reading better. Miss Johnson began to suspect that little Eliza was snooping for something, but still Miss Johnson said nothing about it. The excitement and the secrecy took her mind off Johnny more often and helped her get on with being a little girl. Finally, Eliza was listening near the door when she clearly heard Miss Johnson say, "Raising Eliza would pose some difficulties for you. I'm sure she'll adjust quickly. If this works out, Eliza will be thrilled. I hope so too, for her sake." She just couldn't stand it any longer. Eliza pushed open the office door without even knocking. Miss Johnson hung up the phone just as the door opened. She asked Eliza, "Have you been listening at the door again?" To that, Eliza nodded and asked, "Is the family going to take me?" "Apparently you figured out someone is considering adopting you. Well, it's no use for you to ask anything about it now. They might not be able to follow through, and we don't want to get your hopes up. I know it must be awful hearing this so much, but you need to wait." Eliza's head and heart were spinning, somewhere between excitement and disappointment. Waiting was very frustrating, and she could hardly stand another moment of it. That night she hardly slept, and for several nights afterwards as well. Nearly a week later, Miss Johnson knocked on Eliza's door just after all the children turned in for the night. She came in and sat down beside Eliza on her bed. She supposed that the other children in the room were already asleep. Caressing Eliza's back, she said, "It might not be such a good idea telling you this now, but you've already been kept up thinking about it so much. Probably even tonight you've been lying here thinking about it." Eliza was excited and tried to sit up, but Miss Johnson laid her back down. Miss Johnson explained the couple will find out tomorrow if the adoption is going to be allowed. It was never a matter of deciding if they wanted to, but only if they could. Eliza Beth didn't understand much else the matron said. She figured out they needed to prove they had a good home and then meet someone called a judge to see if he'd allow them to adopt her. Miss Johnson finished by saying, "There are some reasons that the judge might not like it. If it works out, then you'll finally meet them the day after tomorrow in the afternoon." After lunch on the appointed day, Eliza was intent on waiting in the yard to see the people when they came. She stayed around in the front yard waiting, but then there was a butterfly. It was the biggest and prettiest that Eliza ever saw. The little girl began to chase it around in the front yard, but then it went around to the back of the home by the garden. At first she hesitated, but she didn't see anyone coming yet. There were no cars on Twillinger as far as she could see, so she ran after the butterfly. She said, "I'll only go for a second and then come straight back." While in the garden, Eliza forgot all about the plan. After hearing a car door slam shut, she immediately remembered. She quickly ran around the house, but had difficulty opening the gate, separating the front from the back. By the time she arrived at the front, the door was just closing behind them. Eliza Beth rushed into the house, still hoping to catch a glimpse. She saw a foot and a bit of a lady's dress as the office door closed behind them. Again, she missed her chance for a first peek. Eliza waited nervously in the hallway, pacing back and forth. She concentrated hard, trying to listen, but could barely make out a man's voice through the door. There was too much noise about the home. After what seemed like another eternity, Miss Johnson opened the door to go find Eliza Beth. As she turned to walk away, she nearly tripped over the girl, waiting not so patiently in the hall. Eliza Beth was still, almost paralyzed with anticipation. She swallowed hard, took a deep breath, and cautiously walked into the room. "Eliza Beth," Miss Johnson softly spoke, "this is Frank and Evelyn Marsden. They'll be your new family. You'll go home with them today if everything seems satisfactory." The well-dressed couple turned their heads to watch her enter, but they remained seated. Eliza Beth noticed their smiles, which almost seemed too large to be natural. The couple was very eager to talk to her. They asked many questions, and frequently she turned to Miss Johnson to provide the answer. Eliza thought they asked too many questions, but she'd never been adopted before and supposed it was all necessary. Every now and then Eliza tried to slip in a question of her own. She asked things like, "Will I have brothers and sisters?" Or, "Will I have my own room?" Or, "Can I have a light on in the hallway at night?" And, "Will there be puppies or kittens?" Most of the time, the couple gave brief answers to her questions. Several times the wife said, "Now, Eliza Beth, dear, you're just going to have to wait and see. We don't want to spoil all the surprises that'll be waiting for you." After a terser response, Eliza happened to be looking at Miss Johnson's face. She saw the matron's eyebrows make a deep furrow as though she didn't care for the woman's response. Eliza looked at the couple and back again, and the expression had disappeared from Miss Johnson's face. It was highly unusual for a couple to adopt without several visits, but they explained, "We've been traveling through much of the process." Regarding Miss Johnson's concerns over Eliza's African heritage and the problems it would create, the couple only responded, "It seems to be a very progressive notion." While the couple signed one last document, there was a knock at the door. Opening the door, Miss Johnson discovered Tricia, delivering a suitcase for Eliza. At Miss Johnson's request, the other girls did this for Eliza Beth. The girl was too preoccupied with many thoughts to be trusted to remember everything herself. Tricia said nothing, but slipped in and embraced Eliza and gave her one small kiss on the cheek. Then, as quick as she came, Tricia disappeared back upstairs. She knew she shouldn't be underfoot for such a momentous occasion. Before Eliza knew what happened, she found herself in the back seat of the car with her new mother. Eliza's suitcase and the care package prepared by Miss Johnson occupied the front passenger seat. "Besides," the woman told Eliza, "I'll want to be getting to know you better, now that you'll be my own little girl for a time." Eliza liked the sound of that and snuggled up to the woman. The woman recoiled and commented, "Oh, darling, it's much too warm for all that nonsense right now. Tonight, when it's cooler, please." Eliza thought she saw Miss Johnson furrow her eyebrows again, but only for a moment. Now Miss Johnson leaned her head in the open car window. She gave Eliza another small kiss on one cheek while caressing the other. "You be good now, dear Eliza. Don't you worry about anything, and do stay out of trouble." Mr. Marsden waited outside the car until his wife said, "Okay, darling, let's get going." At this, he slid into the front seat, and with a single turn of the key, the old motor started. Miss Johnson's head was spinning as she watched the car slip away, turned the corner, and passed from sight. Though there was nobody to hear, Miss Johnson said, "I don't know what I'll tell poor Johnny." Suddenly, little Tom was at her elbow. He arrived before Miss Johnson and Eliza left the office. Knowing about the adoption, he kept out of sight. He snuck a peek around the corner just before the car drove off. "Ma'am," Tom exclaimed in his low, deep voice, "please tell me that man that just drove off isn't the one who just adopted little Eliza Beth." He knew immediately by the look on her face that it was. He threw his cap on the ground and said, "Why, them two is as clan as I ever was and more. I do declare they really believed the stuff." Miss Johnson's jaw dropped. She looked at Tom in disbelief. Raising both hands to hold her head, she said, "I knew it. I knew something wasn't right. Felt it right down into my bones. But I told myself it was just the mother hen in me.